Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the webinar on safe and sustainable food systems. It's the first in a series from SCS Global Services. Just a bit of housekeeping and logistics to let you know everyone's in listen-only mode. We will have a Q&A session for 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, put them in the question box as they come up and we'll answer them at the end. If we don't get through all the questions, I will follow up with you after the webinar to get those answered for you. This webinar is being recorded and we will be emailing you the webinar recording tomorrow. All right, so my name is Kevin Warner. I am the Manager of Business Development and Sustainable Agriculture at SCS Global Services.
And hi, my name is Josh Edge. I'm the Senior Auditing Manager at SCS.
Before we jump in, a bit of an overview on the webinar series. We are leveraging our staff of knowledge experts to cover a broad range of topics related to food safety and sustainability. We'll have some guests, some external guests joining us on a few of them. Please check it out on our website. You can register for any or all of them. And we are excited to be rolling this out over the next 4 or 5 months. So a bit of background on SCS before we get into the meat of the conversation. SCS is a global company, but we are headquartered in California in the Bay Area. We have offices all over the world. We operate on 6 continents. Don't have any work in Antarctica yet, but maybe in the future. We have subsidiaries all over, and we have sustainability experts across a number of different fields. We were started in the mid-'80s, started in agriculture doing pesticide residue testing as sort of a precursor to the organic movement. And in the intervening 30 or 40 years, we've expanded into a huge diversity of programs. We're not just in agriculture anymore, we're in forestry and fisheries and built environment. We have some world-leading experts on climate change, on greenhouse gas emissions, on carbon footprinting. If there's a sustainability element to an industry, we're probably working on it. And at this point, we operate over 100 different programs. That being said, we started in agriculture and we still have a strong presence there. It's still an area of focus for us. We do food safety training and consulting. Our responsible sourcing business is really quite interesting in that we partner with large operations like Starbucks or Ferrero and help them manage their internal sustainability programs. We offer most of the major food safety audits. We do food labeling like organic and non-GMO and gluten-free. And we also have a ton of sustainable agriculture programs. Over the years, we've developed a reputation as leaders in social compliance and environmental sustainability in food and agriculture. And so we've sort of carved out a space as a certifier of choice for a number of major programs like the Equitable Food Initiative, Fairtrade USA. We've just recently added Rainforest Alliance, and we even have our own program called Sustainably Grown in this space. So let's get to our conversation today. We're going to be talking about food safety and sustainability and how the landscape here is constantly moving, and it's challenging because it feels like the goalposts are always shifting, right? And so we're going to talk about how the things are evolving and how we see growers and brands adapting. But just as an initial overview of the market, the challenge with sustainability is that there's a lot of mixed messaging, right? Every brand, every buyer has their own interpretations, and they go all over the place. Some retailers are really focused on social issues, right? Like Costco, as an example, has been a champion on farm worker protections and fair treatment of workers in their supply chains. Others, especially brands, are really pushing the environmental element. You see announcements in the past year from the likes of Kind Bar, which buys probably 1%, 2% of the world's almonds. They are putting high bar policies in place around pollinator protection and really picking out specific environmental areas that they feel they can have impact on. Government governance is another big one, and especially as more and more investors move into the ag space, right? There's the cost of capital is cheap, and private equity has really moved into agriculture in the last, say, 5 years. They're really looking at ESG measurements, and they want to see good governance at the farm and brand level, to ensure that they're getting a good investment and that they're reducing risk in their investment. So sustainability gets pulled in lots of different directions, and it means different things to different people. On top of that, you've got a real difference in risk by crop, right? So like the almonds I mentioned with Kind Bar, it's a mechanized harvest. They don't have huge workforces, but they've got serious water risk, and they've got pretty significant pollinator risk, right? So some of those subject areas are really specific to almonds, whereas, I don't know, pick cherries, right? The cherry harvest is short, it's 3 or 4 weeks. You have large migrant workforces that are moving up the coast and following the harvest. There's a lot of social compliance risk there, and the profile of a cherry orchard is very different from an almond orchard, right? They're similar in that they're both perennial cropping systems, but the risks are different. And I think a lot of retailers and brands recognize that, right? The buyers are thinking it from a risk-based framework. On top of that, you've got differences in terms of demand with geography. Europe was a very early adopter of sustainability, right? They've been pushing the issue for decades now, and for a long time are really focused on social compliance issues. And that's where a lot of exporters, especially in the tropical fruit space, have been early adopters of sustainability programs because they have to. It's a market, it's a cost of doing business, and it's a market demand. And that's where, you can't sell a banana in Germany without a Rainforest Alliance sticker or a fair trade sticker or a sustainably grown sticker. It's just a cost of doing business. And they've really been driven by those social issues. The protection of farm workers has been a key area. The US and North America more broadly is quickly catching up on the sustainability front, but there seems to be a real focus on environment. The social element is there, but I would say the US retailer and brand space is really taking a more holistic look, probably because they have to, right? Consumers are concerned about the environment. We're all dealing with heat waves and floods and whatever else, and there's maybe a bit more urgency and immediacy. But this is the real challenge for growers and for brands, because every month it seems there's new announcements of sustainability requirements from buyers. In April, Walmart announced really significant requirements for farm and floral, produce and floral suppliers. Like everyone in their supply chain is going to be held to these new requirements, and that includes third-party assurance of integrated pest management practices, right? This is really trying to protect pollinators as the main driver here, and requiring annual audits to various schemes. And they've given you options, but for growers that aren't already doing it, it's going to be a bit of a lift. Maybe even bigger is this commitment of 3% of acreage to pollinator habitat. 3% might seem like a small number, but if you're in Salinas and growing lettuce and you're paying $70,000 an acre, the cost of selling to Walmart is going to be significant if you're farming 100 acres or whatever. And the reason this impact is so interesting, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, is Walmart drives the US market, right? They sell 25 to 30% of groceries. They're responsible for it in the US market, and probably 60 to 70% of the commercial supply chain feeds into Walmart. So when they make these requirements, everyone jumps and everyone does it, and it really does shift the global supply chain. They're also requiring that growers endorse the PMA United Fresh Ethical Charter, which is more of a harmonized industry group push for best practices, especially on the social compliance front. EFI, the Equitable Food Initiative, does offer an actual audit that we do for the ethical charter, but generally it's not an audited program. It's more of a commitment. And so Walmart's pushing on social and pollinator side of things. Other growers or other retailers have their own requirements, and they're going in different directions. Aldi in March announced pretty significant water management requirements for key fruits and vegetables. And I like the approach they've taken, and that it really is risk focused. They're looking at arid, drought-prone regions where they're really implementing these requirements. I live in Missouri. We've got plenty of water. That's not a problem in the same way. So they wouldn't require that of growers here in the same way they would for California or Peru or wherever else. But more as an example, every retailer is going in different directions, and it's really hard to know how to meet all of these requirements. And I think one of the key points we're making today is certifications are a shortcut, right? If you can do a certification that meets, say you sell to Costco and Walmart, you could do a Fair Trade USA or an Equitable Food Initiative audit and meet all of their requirements. And that's a real value where you sort of have a one-stop shop from an assurance standpoint. The other thing too is these schemes are constantly evolving, and that's a good thing, right? There's that continuous improvement element to it. They keep getting updated, and that's in response to these buyer requirements and consumer sentiment. And one of the early adopters of sustainable agriculture indicators is the Global Gap program. They've been sort of championing it for a long time, and they're doubling down in their current revision, that they're just increasing and increasing. And so the real value from my perspective is that you can cover your sustainability and your social compliance requirements in your food safety program. And Global Gap and I would say EFI are the only two programs really doing it. My colleague Josh is going to jump in and talk about how Global Gap is evolving, not just where it is now, but where it's going and how they're adapting to be ready for the future.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so again, my name is Josh Edge. I've been conducting Global Gap audits with SCS since 2013, and I served as the Global Gap Scheme Manager at SCS for 5 years. I just transitioned to a new position as Senior Auditing Manager with a focus on finding new auditors and bringing them on board. So Kevin just provided a good overview of the industry trends, and so now I'm going to provide some specifics within the certification world. So first, I'll give a very brief overview of the Global Gap standard, and then we will review some of the current and future environmental metrics within the standard. So Integrated Farm Assurance, or IFA, is Global Gap's flagship standard. Originally known as Europe Gap, certificates have been issued for IFA for over 20 years, and today over 200,000 growers across the globe are certified to the standard. Global Gap is a risk assessment-based standard that is less prescriptive than other standards benchmarked to the Global Food Safety Initiative, or GFSI, such as Primus GFS and SQF. And the IFA standard relies on farmers and their auditors to identify hazards and assess risks on site. While most other GFSI standards have focused exclusively on food safety, the Global Gap IFA standard has had social and environmental components for many years. And as we just heard, retailers have begun requiring environmental metrics from their suppliers in response to consumer demand. While most consumers simply expect their food to be safe, they also now are interested in what impact their purchases are having. So in the version we're currently auditing against, version 5.3, there are 69 control points that impact the environment and biodiversity and 28 that address worker health and safety. This represents almost half the IFA checklist. The checklist is broken into 3 modules: the All Farm, which covers basic elements of the farm management; crop space module, focusing on record keeping for fertilizer, water, and pesticide use; and lastly, the fruits and vegetables module, which focuses on food safety in the field and following harvest. For those unfamiliar with Global Gap, the IFA checklist has 3 levels of questions, which are known as control points. First, there are recommendations, which are not required for certification, but are often a prelude to what's next for the standard. The next questions are minor musts, which have to be complied with to at least 95% to achieve certification. And the last level is major musts, of which 100% are required for certification. Again, I'll review some of the current environmental and social questions, and then we'll look at what's next for Global Gap. So in the first module, the site risk assessment, again, the All Farm module looks at the big picture, the whole farm's activities, and the site risk assessment requires consideration of environmental impacts, such as how the farm's activities will affect their land and their neighbors. The worker health and safety section asks growers to consider farm hazards and develop policies and procedures to protect farm workers. In the guidance document for IFA specific to the US, it states that producers may use OSHA or their state's occupational health and safety guidance in place of designing their own programs. Finally, the waste and pollution questions, which are very straightforward, ask for growers to list their trash, their operation creates, and describe an appropriate waste stream for each of those items, ensuring fuel tanks do not pose leakage risks, composting where possible, and keeping equipment wash water contained. In the conservation section, this is the first to address the environment and biodiversity directly. So AF 711, which is a minor must, asks for a wildlife and conservation plan that acknowledges the impact of the farm on the environment. This question has existed in IFA since the name change from Europe Gap to Global Gap in 2007. And represents a significant departure from other GFSI food safety standards. The national guidelines provided to growers in 2019 stated they may show evidence of participation in state or federal programs, such as those offered by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to show compliance with this question. AF 712 is a follow-up question and rated as a recommendation, so not required for certification. However, it asks for producers to conduct an assessment of their lands, identifying the existing plants, trees, and animals, and develop priorities and take action to protect or improve habitat either on site, regionally, or through participation in local efforts. A similar control point is currently in version 6, as we'll see in a moment. As with all control points, our auditors look for basic understanding and compliance with these questions. While some initial clients new to Global Gap have some difficulty understanding the requirements at this point, all of our existing clients now have at least a basic written action plan, and I don't see this point as a significant barrier to certification. In both these environmentally focused questions, as well as in some of the social questions, the challenge for producers is often understanding what the standard is looking for. In training auditors, I try to emphasize the need to translate some of the points in the checklist into language growers will understand, and just to discuss with farmers, without providing any prescriptive advice, about the many routes to showing compliance. What we often find is that growers are already doing much more than what they have documented for the Global Gap audit. In the crop space module, soil management section is the next that specifically calls out conservation and asks for an action plan to maintain soil fertility. Most of our growers conduct soil tests and work with crop consultants and can demonstrate compliance with soil analysis results and their nutrient management plans. The follow-up questions largely mirror the USDA's National Organic Program, asking growers to show evidence of techniques to maintain soil structure, avoid compaction, and reduce the possibility of erosion. The water management risk assessment focuses on environmental aspects and was added to the standard with the introduction of version 5 in 2015 as a minor must, and then became a requirement for certification as a major must in 2017. This point was and remains a challenge to growers who are very accustomed to considering biological risks to consumers of their irrigation water, but had never been asked to consider the environmental impacts of their water use. In training auditors and when growers have questions about this point, I always direct them first to the 20 pages of guidance in an annex provided by Global Gap in their Control Point and Compliance Criteria document, the CPCC. Here, Global Gap outlines a wide range of hazards that may be relevant to the farm, as well as specific recommendations on what to include in a farm water management plan. Their annexes are a great resource, and I'm sure these will be expanded on in the new version. Finally, IPM, as Kevin already mentioned, is another area where Global Gap sets itself apart from other standards. This section requires various IPM techniques to be employed in production, and IPM is another area where growers are often doing much more than they give themselves credit for in documentation provided to auditors. Planting schedules based on weather and the history of the site, irrigation timing, culling disease plants, all these things are often second nature to grower, and they may not realize these activities can often be counted as prevention or intervention strategies and evidence towards compliance with the Global Gap standard. So now that we've looked at a few of the environmental control points in version 5.3, let's now look at version 6. So version 6, according to Global Gap, will be published in late 2022 and mandatory in early 2023. Among the more significant structural changes they have proposed, control points and compliance criteria will be replaced by principles and criteria. Subscopes such as the fruits and vegetables and combined with crop subscopes will be replaced with a broader category known as plants. And instead of a checklist broken into the AF, CB, and FB modules, themes will be pulled out of each of these sections, and there will be whole sections based on these themes, such as food safety, production process, and environmental sustainability and worker well-being. Global Gap has also promised a more simplified and customized checklist. So there'll be some kind of process to submit data before the audit, demonstrate compliance, and have a more risk-based checklist that removes unnecessary questions that may not be applicable to an operation. The version 6 draft is currently available, and they are still accepting comments until next week. The environmental sustainability section currently has 70 principles, which, if you recall, closely aligns with the 69 control points in version 5, but there are a few new points and interpretations here as well. So environmental sustainability principle 1 reinterprets and blends aspects of both the site and water risk assessments and looks at the farm's place within a larger context, referencing corridors that connect farm habitat with larger landscapes. Principle 8 concerns management and use of plastics on the farm, minimizing the release into the environment, maintenance, recycling, and consideration of alternatives. Principle 9 looks at food waste and asks for it to be prevented through channeling surplus produce for other human use, such as processing or food banks, and any unusable product to be directed for composting or animal feed. Principle 10, 11, and 12 concern biodiversity management and is a new interpretation of the AF7 conservation questions that we just saw. Here, the recommendations have been elevated to a minor must and ask for a baseline assessment of flora and fauna, creation of plans to protect and enhance biodiversity, and monitoring to assess impact. Principle 11 concerns protecting biodiversity through the plan with actions such as shelters for beneficial insects, buffer zones, or through soil management practices. And finally, Principle 12 focuses on the enhancement of biodiversity through restoration of habitat. There's a note in the draft about additional guidance that will be provided on these 3 points, and I believe this guidance will likely be substantial. Principle 14 and 15 is a major and requires no conversion of forests, wetlands, or areas recognized as high conservation value to agricultural uses. And if there was conversion between 2008 and 2014, that these lands begin a process of restoration. Finally, Principle 70, which is the last point in the environmental sustainability section. This principle asks for farms to, and I quote, contribute to reducing and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So as written, the criteria stop short of asking for substantial evidence of implementation and instead focuses on awareness, consideration, and preparation to participate in practices and initiatives that enable long-term carbon capture in the soil. While currently listed as a recommendation, as we have seen in the past, these points are often upgraded over the years as the standard evolves. So obviously these principles are still in draft form, but I think it's safe to assume this is largely what we will see published next year. And as we can see, Global Gap is increasing their requirements for growers to expand and document their environmental activities. And as Kevin has explained, Global Gap is not alone in this process of ramping up their environmental requirements.
Great, thanks, Josh. A lot of good stuff there, and just to build on that, every scheme is going through this continuous improvement approach, right? Global Gap sets a really high bar in terms of their stakeholder engagement, and there's a level of assurance there for clients, for growers who are participating in it, because you can trust that Global Gap is working with the retailers and the buyers to ensure that the direction they're going is aligned with the direction that the retailers are going. And beyond food safety, all of these sort of major schemes we've got listed here are constantly being updated, right? Rainforest Alliance is rolling out a new version of their standard right now that took multiple years to come together. Sustainably Grown is going through revisions right now. It's expected publication of the new standard next January. EFI and Fair Trade USA continue to adapt to market demands. And so I think that's reassuring for growers that when you commit to these schemes, you know that it will evolve in the direction that you need to go and provide you with sort of a sustainability pathway, right? It's not like an end goal, it's a continuous improvement thing. And so all of these provide really good methodologies and pathways towards sustainability. And it's really about figuring out which one best meets the needs of your buyers, which one best aligns with your brand. There's lots of good options. A few things I want to mention to just have on your radar. One is the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative. So this is effectively trying to be the GFSI, but for social compliance. And it's run by the same nonprofit, the Consumer Goods Forum. They've just released their primary production scope. And essentially what this is a harmonization benchmark for different social compliance schemes in food and agriculture primarily. It's still early stages. I don't see a lot of schemes jumping to get benchmarked to it because it does add cost, but the theory behind it is really good, right? It's because sustainability schemes go in so many different directions. There's over 140 standards out there that you can choose from. It's hard to have alignment, and so it's not as simple as the GFSI, where there are certain best practices in food safety that are non-negotiable. But the idea that, say, an Ahold Delhaize or a Walmart can say they can be agnostic to scheme or to standard and say, we don't care which one you get. Fair Trade USA, Rainforest Alliance, Sustainably Grown, whatever, as long as it's SSCI benchmarked, and there's real value there. So that's something to just keep your eyes on in the coming years. I've been tracking it for over 3 years now, and it still hasn't happened yet. So it's not moving quickly, I guess. It's not fast moving, but it could be a significant shift if it does gain traction. The other thing I wanted to touch on quickly is beyond the holistic standards like EFI or Rainforest Alliance, there are subject matter specific ones that can be really interesting in terms of dabbling in sustainability beyond food safety. One is the Soil Carbon Initiative, which is a regenerative ag standard that's just being launched now. It's a project of Green America that SCS is supporting on, and it's effectively a soil testing protocol that creates a baseline carbon measurement for soils and then demonstrates improvement in carbon sequestration through periodic soil testing. It's sort of a big tent standard, and there's a low barrier to entry. They are very open to all types of farming operations, and it plays into the consumer interest in climate change and how food and agriculture can be part of the climate solution. Going in a different direction, the Be Better standard from Xerces is a really interesting high bar pollinator program that's just specific to pollinators. It's got more stringent requirements than those Walmart requirements I mentioned earlier, where I think they require 5% of acreage be in permanent pollinator habitat. But it's getting a lot of traction with brands because it's got a good consumer-facing label, and it seems to be a good fit with permanent crops, with almond growers, with blueberries, with grapes. We don't offer that at STS yet, but we are working towards that. Another one to maybe not consider a bit, but be aware of is the regenerative organic certification. This is a gold standard, super high bar program that's based off of organic. So, it's sort of a niche product in that you have to be organic before you even start. And then it looks at issues of soil health, the regenerative ag part, the farm worker protections, there's animal welfare in it. And it would seem like, oh, there's not gonna be a market for it because, organic by itself is maybe 1% of acreage in the US, 8% of groceries at the grocery store. It's not a big segment of the market, but the ROC has significant adoption from big brands like Dr. Bronner's and Patagonia and Nature's Path, and they've gotten buy-in and pull-through. So there's some really rapid adoption because they've built a market for it as they've rolled it out. So that's another interesting one that's not applicable to most, but I think is going to be getting traction in the coming years. So just a little recap. Don't be afraid of the future, right? I think to Josh's point, so many of the things that are being added to these standards are already being addressed by farmers. It's really just an issue of documentation and, ensuring the policies and procedures you've created are actually being implemented on the ground, right? So this is not like a sea change, it is incremental. And the other thing is that, as this sort of competitive landscape in sustainability and food safety and agriculture evolves, there aren't surprises. It's slow moving. Walmart comes out with really high bar requirements, but you've got till 2025 for most of them. They gave you 3.5 years. And I think that's a pretty consistent trend is nothing is moving very quickly. But it's an opportunity too to stay ahead of things, right? If you know where things are going, you won't have any surprises. And not every brand or farming operation is going to stay on top of it either. So as these standards shift and as the market shifts, that's a real opportunity from a competitive advantage standpoint to get ahead. And we look forward to partnering with you at SCS. We cover all the standards that buyers want, and we're kind of agnostic to schemes. So we're really here to help you figure out what the best option is for you. It's not a one size fits all kind of deal. And that's it. Again, my name's Kevin Warner. Josh Edge is my colleague who did the deep dive in Global Gap. We're really glad you joined us today. We will jump to a few questions, but so feel free to pop those in the chat box. And we will answer a few, and otherwise we will get back to you later. So Josh, I see a couple on food safety here, and Global Gap in particular. One is, when will version 6 be mandatory?
So yeah, the Global Gap website, these dates sometimes do change, but yeah, what they have currently is that the interim version of version 6 will be published in April of next year, and then the final version in September, and then it will be obligatory 1 year after that interim published. So if it's April 2022 that it gets published, then the obligatory date will be April 2023.
So plenty of time for preparation there.
Yep.
Another question here, what resources are available for existing global gap growers to adjust to the new standard, to implement the new version?
I think there's a lot of public resources out there, as I mentioned in the presentation. So I think the annexes that Global Gap does provide are a wealth of information that auditors can share and are freely available on their website. And so yeah, a lot of information there. I think also because Global Gap allows for other types of state or federal certifications to count towards certification or count as evidence towards certification. I think, the NRCS is a great resource, cooperative extension for growers that have relationships with their local cooperative extension offices, other university programs. UC Davis is a great resource, as is Cornell. And even some associations, fruit and vegetable associations also sometimes have really good resources and are organizing growers to help them adjust to new things coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, makes sense. One other question here. This is, I've been looking to see if there's anything that peat producers could go do to get the Global Gap tag or to ensure that they're respecting Global Gap standards. Have you seen peat bogs included in Global Gap, Josh?
I have not. That's not a scope we've looked into, but maybe you could speak briefly on sustainably grown's approach.
Well, so yeah, actually, we do have a separate standard that's the responsibly managed peatlands program. It's not necessarily aligned with Global Gap, and I think Global Gap, it really is geared towards food. There's a lot of best practices in Global Gap that could be applied to other agricultural production, but the responsibly managed peatlands program is one to check out if you're looking to meet best practices in peat production. Well, I think that's about it on the questions. So we will wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, this is the first in a series of webinars on this broad topic of food systems and safe and sustainable food. So please check out our website. We will have more in coming months, and we look forward to sharing our knowledge with you.
Thanks, everyone.